Hey, Link here. Thanks for joining me for episode 74, where I speak with Niklas Hallin, creator of Yono and the Celestial Elephants, and Molly Medusa, Queen of Spit. We talk about the staples, such as how Niklas got into making games, words of wisdoms they can share, favorite games, their games that made them want to get into making games, and what they do outside of gaming. We also talk about Niklas's unique publishing setup and getting into game making while not yet being a huge gamer. Before we get started, don't forget there are links in the episode description that you can follow to learn more about Niklas, their games, as well as the podcast. Also, don't forget to like and share the episode. And without further ado, please enjoy episode 74. Hi, and welcome to the Red Tunic Podcast, a podcast where I look to rediscover what makes gaming fun and enjoyable by having positive conversations with those related to the industry. My name is Link, and today I'm joined by Niklas Hallin, game creator at Neckbolt Games, responsible for titles such as Yono and the Celestial Elephants, as well as Molly Medusa, Queen of Spit. Hi, Niklas. How are you doing today?
Hello. I am doing great.
Well, that is great to hear. Thank you so much for joining me, by the way, today. You guys, I won't say you guys, but you and as I understand or presume, the team that works on these games or what have you is out of Sweden. So there's, a bit of a time difference for us. For me, it's not even afternoon, and for you, it's evening. So thank you for joining me on your Sunday evening today.
Yeah. That's how you have to do it when you work across the Atlantic Ocean.
Yes, yeah, and thank you. I'm happy that we were able to work out an easier, reasonable time. It's not always, as I'm sure as anyone who's tried to communicate or work with people in different time zones like that, it's not always easy. Sometimes you get into a position where it's only like 6 or 7 hours, but when you look at those 6 or 7 hours and the scheduling, it's just impossible, right? So I'm glad we were able to work it out today. So, Niklas,
yes, me too.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but yeah, I'm happy to hear that. And now, Niklas, before we get started, would you mind telling, me and anyone listening a little bit about yourself, maybe your current projects, or, just what you feel anyone should know about you before we dive into the other questions?
Absolutely. So, my name is Niklas. I am a solo indie developer from Sweden, which means I make video games all by myself, including animation and programming and writing and level design and the whole thing. And in 2017, a couple of years ago, I released my first large video game project, which was Yono and the Elephants, Yono and the Celestial Elephants, which is a very friendly game about an elephant. And since then, I've been working on another significantly more ambitious project called Molly Medusa, which is about a girl with snake hair, a Medusa hair. So everyone around her turns to stone. And that game I have released this year in a strange self-publishing kind of way, which has been a bit of an adventure, basically.
So thank you for sharing that. And I'm curious because, a quick check and from what you said as well, not to say I doubted you, but looking to see the publishers are obviously different. Can you speak to maybe what the difference between going through a regular publishing system? I'm hesitant to say regular just because in this day and age with indie devs or micro studios or what have you, the line between publishers and self-publishing is getting kind of blurred in terms of if it's completely necessary. You're seeing more and more smaller studios self-publishing is what I should be phrasing that as. But can you like speak to the difference in adventure between self-publishing versus going through a publisher in a more like quote unquote traditional manner?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. Um, so publishing a video game requires a whole lot of paperwork and filling in forms and doing like bank information and sitting in like waiting time with Nintendo's administration. And that kind of paperwork is not something that I like to do or am particularly good at or feel looking forward to in my life. So early on, it was very important for me to have some sort of professionals, I should say, someone who has done that before and who knows what forms to fill in and how to get in contact with the correct people. And my plan for the next game, for the Medusa game, was to have some sort of larger, more established publisher again, because that the paperwork task is too daunting. And I was talking a lot to the person who makes music. So as I said, I'm a solo developer, but I'm not a musician, and I have musician friends who compose music for the games that I make. And I was talking to them. There are two of them. They're called Max and Carl, and discussing this issue of should we use a professional or established publisher for this? And the question came up of like, what does a publisher even do? Like, what is today in a kind of internet indie scene the role of a video game publisher? Which is a very strange question. And in the first simple answer is that a publisher can fund development. They can go in with money before the game is launched and then recoup that cost after the launch. But that's not really how I operate. I don't really use up a developer budget like that before the game launch. So the only thing I need is basically help with the paperwork and a little bit of promotion and stuff. So my musician friends, they listened to my complaining about this and said, that sounds kind of like a record label. Like that sounds like the people who work with musicians and put out CDs and Spotify albums, and said, maybe we can do that, right? Maybe instead of having a video game publisher doing that and taking a big cut of the earnings, we could just create a tiny little record label and publish the game ourselves. And yeah, that's totally doable. Like it is very possible nowadays to put a game on Steam, put a game on the Nintendo Store, and the PlayStation Store and all the other platforms are available for like outsiders or what do you want to say, people who are not like established industry giants.
So thank you for explaining that. That's really interesting to hear. Just because as you're describing, like I'm aware that from what I've seen, I shouldn't say like I'm aware as if it's a personal experience kind of thing, but from what I've seen and heard and read, the publishing like that aspect, it always sounded kind of administrative ish, like all the paperwork.
Mm.
But like it was never put out in the way that you described it. Everyone would always be talking about the headache of like going through certification process or what have you, right?
Yeah.
But like hearing that there's a lot of paperwork involved as well, just to like get things rolling. It's really funny that your musician friends now, publisher friends, I guess you would say,
Yeah,
when
absolutely.
when this is just like a record label. We know how this works. Um, so it's like really interesting to hear how similar such a thing is, and like how transferable those skills of um dealing with the people that do this in their world is similar to this. So I'm happy, I should say I'm happy to hear that you were able to work it out and find something that made it easier for like you to do that. And it's just amusing that
Yeah,
musicians are like, oh yeah, we've dealt with this for years, let's go, like we can handle this. So like
absolutely.
just it's funny to hear that, so thank you for sharing that, and I'm happy it's working for you, or working easier for you now.
Yes.
So sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Mm.
So
I was
Nicholas,
just agreeing. Yes.
okay. uh
Go, go.
so Nicholas, I am curious though, just because like how it is that you got started into developing and making games, because it sounds
Yeah.
like the focus for you has largely been um as a small like indie single developer, what have you. um and like you have released a handful, like a few games, more than I've given you credit for in the opening. um so I'm curious, how is it that you got into developing and making games, and from those experiences that you've went through, if there's any kind of words of wisdom that you'd be able to share to help people that might want to avoid some of those pitfalls, or maybe um,
Mm.
have a step up on how to deal with certain things if they come at them. And don't worry about the second part of that question. We can circle back to it if it gets lost. But just like to start with, how did you get into developing and making games?
Yeah, that's interesting. Uh, I am not necessarily a huge fan of video games in the sense that I play a lot of video games. Uh, and when I was like a teenager, I was aware that they existed and I played some video games now and again. But the thing that happened is that I have a very strange brain. I have a very particular brain, and I'm kind of I'm too artistic and uh, bohemian and wild to be like an engineer. But I'm also too systematic and mathematical to be like a performing artist. So I need to do something with my life. And then uh, when I was in high school, someone just posted a newspaper clipping on the wall that said video game developer education is now a thing. And I saw that and was like, yeah, that sounds about right. So I've actually been to school. I've been to university college for video game development, and it fits me very well, specifically because it's such a mixed discipline, right? Like you have very sort of artistic, creative aspects with animations and sound effects and visuals and colors and everything, but it has to be organized in a systematic fashion because it has to be able to run on a computer, right? So and that's kind of how I ended up being a solo developer too, because I figured you needed a team, right? You need maybe 10 people or 100 people to make a game. And it was such a struggle for me to learn to work together in a team. It was easier for me to just learn how to write code myself than to work together with programmers. So I ended up kind of acquiring more and more of the necessary skills. Uh, and Yeah, the end result is that I'm working with video games mostly because I am kind of good at it rather than because I have a particular fascination for video games themselves, which is a bit of a odd sort of entry point, I think. But it makes a lot of sense if you think it's if you see it from that perspective.
So thank you for that, and we will circle back to that in just in a
Yeah.
moment or two, because there are some things I would like to ask about that within the context of this last question. However, before we get too far off the strain or the line or plot for this one, I guess, from what you've experienced, for how you've learned, like what you've done, do you have any words of wisdom that you can share for people that might be looking to get into it, so they can, like as I said before, maybe avoid some of the headache that you went through, or just
Mm.
have a better idea of how to navigate things that you found worked well that you wish you knew how to better take advantage of, or what have you.
One thing to just note is that it's quite easy nowadays to make video games. Like there are tools available for free that are very easy to uh, learn and work with, uh, which is fascinating. Like we have this thing that we call a game engine, which is software used to develop video game inside, where a lot of the like rendering graphics to the screen and doing physics simulations and this how to structure the code is already done, right? All of that work is already established. So you can just get an engine like Unreal or Game Maker or RPG Maker or Game Boy Studio or whatever, and you can get very far on that. So it's not so terrifying as it might seem to become a video game developer. And it's also not so terrifying to do it alone or with just a few friends. You can get really, really far. That said, a good place to start is to not do 3D graphics immediately because 3D graphic adds a whole new, well, it adds a whole new dimension. Wow, great. It gets exponentially bigger. Like the 3D game gets bigger than a 2D game in just how complex it has to be. And the big thing is that a 3D game has a camera that views the 3D models in the world, whereas a 2D game just kind of renders pixels onto the 2D screen. And so the big trick is to, even if you want to use 3D models, because it's quite easy to reuse animations. For instance, if you have a 3D model, you can animate it in many different ways quite easily. Maybe have some form of static camera, maybe have a side scroller camera or some sort of top-down view or something, because you can design the game as if it's a 2D game, even if you use 3D graphics, and that's going to cut out a lot of just difficulties.
So, thank you for that advice. And weirdly, or coincidentally, I should say, enough, that kind of mirrors some advice from my last guest that I recorded with. Yeah, like that episode's not out yet, so I'm not gonna like directly refer to things or what have you. However, I just find it interesting that back to back guests have both kind of went the direction of 2D's the safer place to start to learn because it's easier. Different reasons, of course, across you and their reasoning. But at the same time, it's amusing to hear that. And I don't, I understand what you're saying. I don't disagree from my viewpoint, that learning how to do something with less things that you'd have to juggle. Like in your case, as you mentioned, the 3D camera, or the camera itself, as opposed to like a fixed view position, right? A
Yeah.
friend of mine years ago, he was playing around with one of the game engines just for just for fun. I think it was Blender, because for those that don't know,
Yeah.
Blender has a game engine inside of it. Shocking. Not a lot of people talk about that one. Um, and he was lamenting over the logic that he couldn't think of the logic that he needed to approach it with to make the camera work well enough. Um, and you know, I can understand that if you're just learning how to do anything game related, that's just an extra layer of complexity that would cause
Yeah.
a headache. So I thank you for that advice, because I think that is, from my view, from my standpoint, that's fantastic advice, because um, something I learned years ago was one of my teachers just said, keep it simple, stupid, in terms of anything
Yeah.
we wanted to do. So like the simpler you keep it, the easier it's going to be, and the better you can learn, and then you can iterate on top of what you've learned. So at some point, what's simple to you might actually be something really complex, right? But like just the iterative process and all of that fun stuff. So thank you for that advice. I appreciate it. I think that's good advice that um
I
you know
think
often overlooked.
I think it's striking that when the Nintendo 64 came out, which was the first sort of 3D game console, and they released Super Mario 64, and they had to put in a character, a little guy on a cloud, to represent the 3D camera so that they can tell the player what that is. Like, what is it that's going on in 3 dimension? They had to have a little guy on a cloud filming Mario to transition from the Mario side scrollers to the 3D. And then they did the Zelda game, Ocarina of Time. They had a little fairy flying around your head and nagging your ear off every time you took a step, because they needed to tell new players what was possible to do in a 3 dimensional world, right? And it's easy to forget that nowadays, because now you can download a video game engine of the internet, Unreal or Blender or Unity or whatever, and you can create a 3D scene, and there are like pre-made packages for camera controls that you can just import into your scene, and it will work out of the box. And I'm like, yes, that's tantalizing, but it's not. You should be a little bit humble whenever you import a 3D character controller into an empty project. You should think about Super Mario 64 and the little turtle guy on the cloud, because it's not actually as simple as you'd think.
Yes, I know exactly what you're saying. It's always good to keep in mind, you know, how we got to a certain point, or like how we got there. And I think that's a good transition for the question that I did want to circle back to, and it was um on the topic of you not being incredibly into playing games, and like you went, as you said, you went to
Mm-hmm.
school for it, and you would have walked in, and I'm presuming the people, or I should say assuming, because presuming in this case, you did this, so presuming it's already kind of out the window, but I'm assuming that you walked into this and you would have been going to school, taking classes with people that have been playing games their entire life, and
Yeah,
what have you. So like um I'm wondering about that experience for you, for someone that would have went
yeah,
into it with maybe not a whole lot of knowledge of the past, or what have you, and standing with people that have been, as I said, assuming would have been playing games and had like all this kind
yeah.
of knowledge experience from just exploring and on hands on, what have you. So like how did that work for you, and like was that actually we'll start with that, we'll move on from there after.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It is true. I did spend a lot of time playing games on easy mode, just to keep track of what everyone was talking about. I played like many different games on easy mode just to see what they were up. And I also you can you can watch people play video games on YouTube and Twitch. Like you don't actually have to play them yourself. You can have uh, a YouTube series going on in the background on your computer of someone playing games from the 90s, games from the early 2000s, and recent games that came out now, and just kind of get a feel for what they're like. Uh, because the thing is, learning about video game design, like one of the big eye-opening uh, changes of perspective from studying game design is to think of game design as an abstract discipline in and of itself that is separate from the visuals and the programming and all that. Like the design itself is also part of the game, and to see that and to see the patterns, which means that a lot of times I bet that a lot of video game developers have told you this, they can't play games normally anymore because their design analysis brain just sees through the game. Like you play it for half an hour and you're like, good, now I have seen what this game is because I've kind of taken out the structure of it. In much the same way that film critics and filmmakers can't watch movies anymore because it's just their trade,
Yes, I know exactly what you're saying, and like I I think, how do I put this? How do I want to put this one? I think a lot of people also kind of fall prey to that, because like as you said, you can watch people play games on YouTube, on Twitch or what have
Mm.
you. And that's not to like, what I'm about to say is not to like dismiss people that do that, or people that you take analytical skills from other people that give or explain like the process for looking into something and analyzing it, or what have you. I want to be very careful with that one, just because this can sound really arrogant or pretentious, or talking down, or what have you, right? That not the intention is what I'm getting at from what I'm about to say. um but I think like one of the biggest difficulties when it comes to that is also being able to tread ground on knowing that you have some film critics that are very good at it, and having like a foundation of their own thoughts, and like coming at it from a point of view of looking at standard story structure and all of this, and talking
Mm.
about how like a movie or a game or whatever falls apart. And then you have some people that point out, will point out some tropes and be like, well, this game relies too heavily on like the hero's journey, which hero's journey is an easy target for the conversation. I'm gonna throw that out there.
Mhm.
But you'll have
Yeah,
people that will like go,
fair
oh, this
enough.
relies too easy on this, and it's like, well, like, yeah, but there's only so many different structures. So I think like
Mm.
it can get difficult in that regard, um, because like you have to be careful to not swing too hard into that direction when you are trying to dismantle. I don't know the right word, um, for like breaking things down when you're trying to go about it. Um, I hope that makes sense for what we were going from. Otherwise, I'm just a rambling mess of nonsense. But no, I understand what you're saying. Like I imagine sorry, I'll wrap this around to make it more easy. I imagined finding that line, that fine line or what have you, to walk, to not lean too far into falling into the trap of going overboard versus not enough to like figure things out,
Mm.
would have been difficult in your case when you were like coming up and learning, because if you're kind of crash coursing and you're listening to other people, it's hard. It can be hard to not incorporate too much of their opinion and let that sway you too much, right? So I imagine it
Yeah,
would have been hard
absolutely.
finding your own understanding, your own voice, while you are taking in all sides and like the whole kind of quote unquote community or whatever at large, right?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was of this age, World of Warcraft was very big, and a lot of players were playing World of Warcraft. And World of Warcraft is one of those games that you can play for just hours, like you can play that for hundreds of hours. And you can get really, really involved in the like minutia of exactly how every system works. And there comes a point where I'm kind of glad that I did not play World of Warcraft. I tried it for like a month or something on a free trial, and I'm kind of glad that I am not one of the persons who spent my formative years just extremely involved with World of Warcraft, because it becomes a bit all consuming, and you don't really get a broad knowledge base as much as a very deep knowledge base. And also, people who have opinions about World of Warcraft have very strong opinions about World of Warcraft.
I understand completely what you're saying. I'm lucky in that I typically um don't suffer from addiction in the sense of like having to be like, I gotta play this game, I need to do it. Like a lot of it
Mm,
becomes habit or just like part of just what I do as a thing. Like for some gacha games, like little phone games,
mm,
it's just I have a few things I have to do for a daily thing, whatever. I get in, I do them. I'm like, okay, I'm done. Um, and the same can be for some of the online, like some of the games like World of Warcraft that I tried. It became very quickly okay, so I have to go do this. Like Guild Wars 2, for example, for me very quickly was okay, so this is all this is. And after about like a month, I was like, I'm good, I can move on. But I understand what you're saying there because especially from the standpoint of like if you are trying to experience or see different things, um, getting all consumed by one is probably going to make it difficult to have free time to do other things. And at the same time, like you said, the community at large, can be largely very vocal. And like it makes sense if you are putting so much time and yourself into
mm.
what you're trying to do, right? That you would have very strong opinions about that. And like, that's not just World of Warcraft. There's a bunch of games like that. Um, but yeah, I understand what you're saying in the sense of like, you can't, it didn't work for you, right? Um, so I am curious as well then. So when you did go to school and, going in not really being someone that had played a whole lot of games or was just starting to so you could understand them and, starting to like get involved in different forms of the community. Um, how did that work with like your peers? Like I'm just curious how like was how did that work when like they would be talking about things like you mentioned Mario 64, which
Mm.
Mario 64 was probably in my mind, my like thought, my opinion, what have you, it was like the first 3D game that actually got 3D right. And you look at it now, you go back to it now, it's still a little rough. However, before that, before that for 3D games, it was just more than a little rough. They were like almost impossible or just
Yeah,
very like what have you. The very huge level of difference in quality of camera control for Mario 64 to what came before it is what I'm getting at.
exactly.
And like you had
Exactly.
mentioned, that. So I'm just wondering, like, how did that work when you walked into university or school or college or however you want to phrase it for however it's done
Yeah,
in your area
in
because different
Europe, exactly.
yeah. But like, how did that work for you when you'd have people talking about maybe being like, oh yeah, Mario 64's camera, this is what you want to kind of have as your baseline for how good you are,
Mm.
being someone that would be going, I have no idea what that means. Do you know, like, does what I'm trying to ask, does that make sense? I'm sorry, it was kind of rambly and weird.
Yes, to some extent. Specifically, I remember having blind spots for like PC strategy games and the sort of like Civilization and StarCraft and games like that. People were talking about very minute details, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna go and have to Google some things because I don't know what any of this means. But that's the thing. You can Google a lot of things and do research, and it's almost like video game history. You know, we only have a couple of decades of video games existing, and there's already a lot of just history, the academic history, you know, and that's a fascinating research topic. And a lot of my references are going to be to like Mario 64 and games from like the 90s, and because that's a that's a period of video game history where stuff is very easy to see. Like the games are more primitive in a very like literal sense. They're more primitive, which means they're easier to kind of see how they work. Whereas now you look at a game like, let's say, the new Spider-Man game or the new God of War. There's a whole lot of thing going on the screen every time. Every single second has a full screen of stuff. And everything is very smooth. The camera controls, for instance, and the character controls are very smooth, and all the animation blend into each other very smoothly. And like I remember so clearly, the guy who worked on God of War, and his job was to make the boat connect to the landing when you step in and out of the boat in God of War. And that was like his job, and it took years to get that boat to behave smoothly. And that's really fascinating. That kind of level game design, the super AAA, super big budget game design. But it also means that as an outsider, someone who did not work on the project, to look at video footage of Game of God of War or playing it for yourself, you don't even realize that the boat moves in a certain way. Like it's so smooth and frictionless that most players won't even, it won't occur to them that the boat did something specific when they landed from riding the boat, right? So that's why it's friendlier to look at older video games, because if you look at a Nintendo 64 game or a Super Nintendo game and something happens on the screen, you can often kind of see what happens. Like it's not smooth. It's just visible on the screen.
So yes, I completely understand what you were saying, and like, you know, that makes sense. And you know, yeah, like the complexities of games now are through the roof, realistically. Like, you know, if all you primarily did when you were younger, and this isn't directly like at you in this scenario, but however, if you like primarily what you your experience was with was consoles, you know, the incredibly complex console games were few and far between, right? So like
Yeah.
compared to comparing, like you said, it's, you know, the game industry is like a couple decades, like 50 years, I think, kind of might be pushing it in terms
Mm.
of overrepresenting. um but like,
Yeah.
but no, you're absolutely correct, because like 20 years ago, what a console could do versus what a console can do today is absolutely bananas. Like, before it
Yeah,
was a very different experience, and now a console can pretty much deliver a PC level complexities. And I say that in the sense of something like an immersive sim where high inventory management systems or
yeah,
what have you, where there's all these other systems at play. Like you mentioned with God of War, how someone's whole job was just making sure whenever they wanted to dock the boat at the landing, it was perfect. It worked,
yeah,
and it was like seamless from like if they came at it from like the front, from the side, from the back, from like all of those variables. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and we're gonna stick on this one a little longer. The you're in time in school or what have you, just because I think
mm,
it's a fascinating kind of area.
yeah.
Um, and I'm curious, before you went into school, because you had mentioned before, I don't know if it was during us recording or before we were, when we were getting into it, the preamble, if you will, talking about how like you didn't have a lot of experience playing games or what have you. So like I'm curious, before you went to school, if you had a favorite game, and then after you went to school, after you would have been talking with more people, immersed into it, if you
Mm,
found a new favorite game um, after like you were kind of thrown into it. So basically, like a before and after school, if you have a favorite game for
yeah.
for both those eras, I guess.
That's an interesting question. Uh, I very distinctly remember playing Psychonauts, the first Psychonauts game, which is this kind of action platforming 3D adventure kind of thing. And that was mostly that's kind of the genre that I come from to some extent. I've been talking about Zelda, I've been talking about Mario, I've been talking about Psychonauts. Like they had, even if Psychonauts was available on the PC, it still had a kind of a console game feel to it. And I specifically remember that I bought the box in a bargain bin and had never heard of the game before. And it said on the front of the box, it said from the mind of Tim Schafer. And I had no idea who Tim Schafer was. Now he's kind of a little bit famous because of his kickstarting, crowdfunding shenanigans and stuff like that. And there's a Psychonaut 2 nowadays. But at the time, there was no way of knowing who that guy was. However, the fact that his name was on the title, like, that was on the box art, it kind of opened my eyes a little bit to the fact that a person made this, right? Like this is created by individual people with names and addresses, you know? uh, so at the time, I was mostly playing these platforming, 3D platforming kind of things. But I'm gonna mention another game that's really, really good, which is Heroes of Might and Magic 3, which is a hugely complex PC strategy game. Uh, Also really old, but it has stood the test of time in a way, and I got more into it after studying to be a game developer than I ever managed to do as a young person because it's pretty tricky to learn if you're young. So there's a little bit of transition there from action platformers to these sort of complex strategy games.
So thank you for sharing that, and I understand what you're saying, and I imagine as someone that would not have been like fully aware, seeing the game creator or like the main guy or someone, I'm gonna
Mm-hmm.
say game famous, having like their name on the box art, might like that must have been like a mind-blowing thing, because like a
Yeah.
lot of times, and even now there's still very few developers that I think command this or ask for this or demand it, or however you want to phrase it. But like, like for example, like Sid Meier, his name would pop off on things, and like, at some point I wonder if that was just, well, it was marketing for him, but at the same time it like would help people be like, oh, this is a game he made, a new thing, follow along or what have you. But like, if you're not aware of, like in Tim Schafer, for example, coming from Lucas Art, being a part of like a whole bunch of point and click, that era, and being famous for that era, not having any idea who that is, must have been like an experience to be like, oh wow, look at this guy's name is on this. It's similar to like, I think the best analogy would be like if you were buying a book and it was just like The Shining, and you didn't have Stephen King's name, it just said The Shining and then the publishing house, right? Similar to how most games work now, you have to like and like beat the game or go to the credits to like, oh, this was, Stephen King wrote this, but like it's not on the cover. It just says I don't know who publishes horror. All I'm thinking of is like Tor Media, but they're like sci-fi. Anyway, that doesn't matter. But like, I imagine that would have been just like a mind-blowing thing to be like, oh wow, there are famous game developers that have a history that command knowledge or like a following or what have you, right? And in the same vein, I've talked about this before. I think a handful of people have that I've spoken with actually, but like Heroes of Might and Magic 3 is an absolutely fantastic game.
Absolutely.
I absolutely love it. I personally, I think before the full edition was available through GOG or what have you, I owned the complete edition on CD, and I spent like a whole evening trying to install it on like Windows 10 and make it run on Windows 10. Fun fact, the secret to making it work on Windows 10, if you have a disc, to anyone listening, is to install it and then download a no CD. Just download a no CD, and it'll run fine after that. Because for whatever reason, its biggest issue I found was trying to verify the CD was in the drive after installing it to play. It was a whole thing. Anyway, but yeah, two great games, and I'm glad like that was kind of your experience, the before and the after. Just because like it's interesting to hear, being like getting to hear that and like knowing that other people enjoyed those games, especially Heroes of Might and Magic 3. I'm a huge soft spot for that game because it's bananas, and a fairly complex game as well, to be honest. So you had mentioned that in your scenario you kind of got into, you saw a posting for it, you weren't really big into games. Was there a game that you did play though that made you go, oh, this would be fun to do? Or was it very much just you finding or learning about the balance between having a little bit of like a design brain, or like having more of the design part of your brain and more of the like logical engineering part of your brain kind of being in balance instead of like one way or the other? And I imagine that question might be a little weird, or at least some people that listen might be like really confused what that means. And like the short and long of it is, like parts of your brain are, more logical or more design oriented. And like typically they're not in balance. And as someone, like I think I can relate to you as someone where they're kind of in balance in different ways. It can be hard to find something to do or what have you, just because you don't really get to excel one way or the other, because both things are equal. And it's like a jack of all, in my case it's a jack of all trades, where I can do things okay but not amazingly. And well, personally I hate it, but anyway, I'm not saying that's the case for you, that it would be like, you're middling at best. I'm middling at best is what I'm saying. Anyway, did wow. What I'm getting at is, before you realized game development was a thing, or at least how that could work, was there, like, did you play a game that made you go, oh, this would be cool to get into?
Yes, there's a good answer for this question, which is the 2D Zelda games, like A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening and the Oracle of whatever, Oracle of Ages, I think it's called. And there's Minish Cap, isn't there? There's a whole host of like Game Boy Zelda games where you go around in these labyrinths and you find these items and you open up new paths to the labyrinth, right? And that's basically what I'm like still today is basically the kind of game that I'm aiming to make. Specifically these labyrinths or like where these big temples, like where all these rooms click together and you have to sort of navigate back and forth between the rooms. And it's a very specific genre, and it's quite different from what Zelda became when they started doing full 3D games, right? The map-like labyrinths don't really translate super well into 3 dimensions. I like 3D Zelda games as well. They're very good, but they're not really the same as the 2D top-down Zeldas. And they made a 3D remake of Link's Awakening for the Nintendo Switch a couple of years back, which looks very adorable, and it kind of looks like a little toy world, like the plastic toy world where you walk around in. And it's really good to see how you could translate that kind of game and that kind of level design to a 3D game and make that work, because making teeny tiny pixel art games nowadays, when they have to be displayed on these huge HD monitors that people have, it's a bit rough. Like, it's a bit rough to play the Game Boy Link's Awakening on a modern, massive TV screen. But yes, and I absolutely have memories of being like a small child and drawing on paper these labyrinths. Like, there's an old PC game, and I don't even know what it's called. But you walk in labyrinths and you find different kind of shoes that are green shoes that make you, and then you can find ice skates to go on the ice. And it came free with like Windows 95 or something like that. And that also has a strong vibe of like you look down on the world from above and you move a little guy around and there's a labyrinth.
So, thank you for sharing that. And I know the game you're thinking of, by the way, I just had to Google it really quick because I recognized it. It's called Rogue's Quest.
Yeah.
It was, yeah, it never came with my version of Windows 95. I knew some people that did, and I was always jealous of it because it always fascinated me. But anyway,
Yeah.
aside from that, but no, I understand what you're saying in terms of like the older 2D Zelda games, kind of would be hard to translate to 3D. And that Link's Awakening was like a great template, a great example of how it could work. I personally hope for more of those in the sense of like Oracle of Seasons or Oracle of Ages, because as you said, you played at least one of them, and they were fun games. And like, I'm glad that to hear that the games that you played before, or like that kind of inspired you, were Zelda games, only because I'm kind of biased. I'm impartial to Zelda. So
Yeah, of course.
I'm happy to hear. I'm always happy to hear when Zelda is like an inspiration to people, because Zelda's an inspiration to a lot of people, and it's great to hear. So thank you for sharing that, Nicholas. Now, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. However, I do have one other question I'd like to ask before I before we wrap this up, before I let you get on with your Sunday evening. And that is, outside of, well, this one I think is going to be a little more poignant for you, only because, um, you're outside of making games. It's not something you do, you don't play them a whole lot. So
Mm.
like outside of games, what do you do to relax? Like, what do you enjoy doing?
Yeah,
How do you relax?
that's a very fascinating thing. Uh, and it's also something that I would like to stress to other game developers, which is that you can take inspiration for video game development from outside of video games, and that's very beneficial. And I tend to read books, uh, fiction books, sure, but also like tend to read about like ancient philosophy or more modern philosophy, and I listen to podcasts about history and literature and stuff like that. Uh, this came across as very pretentious when you asked me what I do to relax, and I said I read I read philosophy tomes. That's not really exactly right, but in a way, kind of yes. Like and movies. I specifically tend to like old weird movies, and I tend to like old weird comic books too, like and old video games. I don't. It's because of what I said before about how they're more sort of primitive and less smooth than what the latest Hollywood movie that came out this summer is, so you can see the artifice. That's a nice word. You can see that human hands made this because it has wonky practical effects, and sometimes like the boom mic comes into the shot and stuff like that. Uh, so I'm not, and I another way to phrase this, which is not what I personally do, but a lot of game designers, they like dance or go mountain climbing or play drums in some sort of punk band or whatever, like more outgoing activities. I tend to be a little bit more in my home next to a bookshelf in in my personal life. But I think that's quite important. Like if that's the theme of this whole episode is to be a game developer without being a gamer, and one of the benefits of that is you can have like a broader perspective that comes outside of the video game sphere. And one of the favorite things that I have is books of on various topics and fiction genres.
So, thank you for sharing that. And like I understand what you're saying, and like especially in your case, it's interesting just because like we've mentioned several times, it's not gaming isn't something that you were doing heavily before or after
Mm,
or during or what have you. And it's just interesting to hear that like where some of your influences or what have you would have been coming from would have been like just reading older stuff or watching older movies. And I understand, like I understand the direction you're going with that. And it's as you put it, like the term primitive, in the sense of like
mm,
what they're doing is more, or I'm presuming, or I'm interpreting it as what you're saying is what they're doing is more based in not overly complex things, just because like
mm.
they couldn't, right? Like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 3D animation or special effects or what have you was going to be highly based in practical effects, and like getting to
Yeah,
see practical effects versus seeing something that is uh, purely like 3D today, um, is a very different kind of experience. And I can understand why and how you would enjoy like that experience, right? Because it's going to inherently just feel more real. Like if you for example, like I'll
Mm,
use The Thing as an example. Like if you look at The
mm,
Thing, when all of like that was all practical effects, that's going to feel more real, more grounded in reality, because it's not going to have that like weird uncanny valley sheen to it, right? Because it's, that all of that was real prop stuff and has a
mm,
foundation in like actual physical existence. That's how I'm interpreting what you're saying, is like, the groundingness of it or what have you is going to be more real, even if the movies are a little more. I don't remember off the top of my head right now, sorry, the exact word you used, but like even if they are a little more weird or like out there kind of thing, they're still going to be based in a physical reality, right?
mm. And like a craft, a handcraft, like these practical effects from old movies. You can imagine someone making that with their hands, with like paintbrushes and sculptor's clay and in a little workshop, right? You can you can kind of see the person, the special effects team who made that model. Whereas if you watch the latest Marvel superhero movie, like on some level that there's a lot of artists rendering Captain America's suit when he walks, but it's kind of obfuscated. Like it's hard to really get a grasp of what the work that went into this uh, these images, what they're like. Whereas imagining sculpting a weird little monster creature, like you probably did that in kindergarten, so you probably have a direct sensual experience of what it's like to make practical effects movies.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in a good example as well would be like, if you look at the old Star Wars movies, like the original Star Wars.
Mm.
I shouldn't say old. There's
Yeah.
several layers of old now, depending on how old you might be. But like with like A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. I
Mm.
remember the original VHS tapes I owned, and they had like in the first like 20 minutes of every video, it was George Lucas and LucasArts and the special effects team talking about their approach for things, and talking about how when they did the Death Star scene, it was like 20, 30 ping pong tables out in a parking lot, and
Yeah.
like the effects team was basically they just went and bought up like every model kit they could get, and they basically just like
Mm.
glued down buttloads of like fighter jets, battleships, like whatever they could get,
Mm.
and then rigged it up with little like whatever they used for explosives, and then just drove a truck mounted with a camera like at close view watching it, right? And like they just
Yes.
rip by as blowing stuff up, um and like literal physical, plastic bits and everything are flying out and all this fun stuff. And then like you look at it today, and that similar to like the Captain America example or the clay example, like it doesn't exist in that way today. Like that, no way to discredit the talent, the ability, like what have you,
Mm.
that anyone has to do that. But like
Absolutely.
it's like if you when you learn that it's literally just like hundreds of plastic model kits being exploded, you can go, I could do that if I want. It's kind of like watching someone make like Lego animation now. Like even if,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
on a foundational level, you go, oh, I understand what they're doing, and you can play around with it and have fun. And it's not like you needed 20 years of it, or I shouldn't say 20. It's not like you need to go through school or have lots of experience to at least get jumping in and starting. You can literally just like grab the little minifig that you might have sitting on your desk and just like take a few
Yeah.
pictures, because like that's kind of what they did in those old movies. Not exactly, but like, it was something you could play with on your own and quickly iterate on. In a same way for maybe starting with something not as difficult in video games for 2D.
Yeah.
I did not intend to like loop all the way back around there, but it just sort of presented itself. But no, Nicholas, I understand what you were saying, and like again, I don't know if I interpreted it all wrong for for older movies. However, I understand at the same time, regardless of if I'm interpreting it wrong in that aspect. Having something just more real, I guess you would say, right?
Mm, mm,
Now, Nicholas, as I said, like before we got into this question about what you do outside of gaming or outside of dev work or what have you, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. So I do want to
mm.
let you get on if your Sunday evening, get ready for tomorrow, have some more time to basically relax before having to actually jump back in to the Monday 9 to 5 or what have you, right? However, if there was anything else you wanted to discuss, like a cool game that you might have came across, or in your case, a cool book or a older movie you think
Mm.
people might enjoy, or basically just what you're doing or something you feel more people should be aware of, by all means, the floor is yours. Please let everyone know where they can find more information about you, the studio or the dev team, or in your case, like the publishing team. Sorry, I don't know how to phrase this one just because the two faces
Yeah,
of it. As well, like where they can just find more information about you and the team and the games, basically. And I'll be sure to also include that in episode description.
fantastic. Yes. So the game that I released this year is called Molly Medusa, and it's kind of like it has this sort of Zelda level design, dungeon design that I have been talking about, and uh, it's also a full 3D game with a fully movable camera. Uh, so that's a big step up for me. I've been talking this whole episode about making 2D games and making static camera games, and part of that is because I have just finished a project that does not have a static camera, and uh, that was a big step out of my comfort zone. And my older game is called Yono and the Celestial Elephants. It's very adorable. You play as a baby elephant going on adventures and solving puzzle dungeons and labyrinths, because that's what it's all about. Uh, the best podcast I've ever listened to is called History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. But it's very hard to recommend that now because it's hundreds and hundreds of episodes long by this point. So you should have gotten into that a couple of years ago when it was fewer episodes. But that's the kind of podcast that brings together history and philosophy. That's right in the title, which is, I think, a very good way of learning about the world through a historical lens. The history of video games is kind of how I learn about video games. So uh, my my I'm developing game under the name Neckbolt, which is a reference to the bolts that Frankenstein's monster have in the movies, to bring us back to the old movies. And I have now started self-publishing under the label Burning Planet together with a couple of musicians, and we'll see how that works out for us in the future. And thank you very much for having me on your show.
So, Nicholas, by all means, I was going to say you're welcome. I always feel weird saying you're welcome because it always feels kind of weird. But it was my pleasure is the way I should continue saying that one. But no, it was honestly my pleasure. It was great fun getting to speak with you, and hear things from your angle. especially because of how you got in. That was a very interesting interesting approach. So, thank you for making the time to speak with me. I had a blast getting to hear about how you got into everything and talk with you. So yeah, by all means, as I said, the pleasure was all mine. And yeah, I'll be sure to include, the as you said, like the Twitter for the studio and the publisher. Sorry, I was trying to think of the right word for how to phrase all that. And then and the most recent games. So yeah, but as I said, thank you, and I don't want to take up more. Wow, I'm screwing up at this ending. I don't want to take up much more of your time, however. So as I said, if there wasn't anything else, I'll definitely let you get on with your evening.
Very, very good.
Awesome. So thanks again to Niklas for making time to have this conversation with me, and thank you for joining us on the Red Tunic podcast, as well as a special thanks to Ronald Jenkins for the use of music from the title track from Road Steve. And be sure to check out the episode description for links to socials, websites, and other means that will allow you to learn more about or support Niklas and the podcast. And while you're doing that, also be sure to like, follow, share, you know how all that works. And thanks until next time.